This video will be for the Welt sample pocket. We have several pattern pieces for this particular sample. We've got our Welt sample base. So this is just a basic rectangle that we're going to be stitching our pocket onto. And then we've got these drill holes here that show us where our pocket will be. And then we've got our welt. So this is the piece of fabric that will actually form the welts of our pocket. And I've got a quick sample here to show you what it's going to look like in the end. So this white rectangle here, those are two little flaps that kind of meet in the middle of the pocket. Those are our welts. And then this is our pocket flap. And then we have our full pocket below. So that white piece of fabric is our welt. So I've got that pattern piece here, and then the fusing piece to go with it. I've got our facing. So this facing, you'll see on the sample that I showed you, our pocket bag is going to be made out of lining. But when we first open that pocket, we don't want to see the lining. So we have this facing that goes on the inside that matches our garment fabric, so that the first thing we see when we open that, it matches to our garment. So that will be our facing. And I've got these cut out of 3 different prints of cotton so that it's easier to see what's happening on camera. But whenever you do your sample, you're welcome to cut all of the cotton pieces out of the same cotton print that you have for your notebook. So facing piece out of that same cotton as my garment or my base, and then the fusing piece to go with it. And then I've got the pieces of my pocket flap. So this is my top flap, which will be fused. So I've got my fusing piece to go with that. And then my under flap. And I can tell the difference because they have a double notch for the under flap and a single notch for the top flap. And then the last piece we have is out of our lining fabric is our pocket bag. So this is the pocketing that will go on the back. That one's fully blue, so we know we need to cut it out of lining fabric. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, one thing, sorry, before I move on, is the welt. You'll notice that the welt is a different grain than the rest of your pieces. So all of your other pieces, the grain is going vertical. On this one, the grain is going the opposite way. So when you cut it out, you'll need to turn it on its side and cut it with this grain line parallel to your selvage. The reason for that is when we have that rectangle going horizontally across our pocket, we don't want it to have any stretch so that our pocket doesn't stretch out of shape as we use it. So it'll get a lot of wear and tear as we put our hand in and out of that pocket. And so we cut this welt on a different grain so that it doesn't have that stretch going across and it doesn't lose its shape. So make sure you cut that one properly. Okay, let's go ahead. I'm going to set aside my pieces that don't need any fusing, and I'm going to fuse the ones that do. So I'm going to grab my facing, my top flap, and my welt. Those 3 pieces all need to be interfaced. So flip them over to the wrong side of the fabric. Lay your interfacing bumpy side down, glue side down. And then we'll go ahead and interface those. Excuse me. And then as always, you want to check that by rubbing your fingers on the edges and making sure that the edges aren't going to start peeling up. Okay, once we've got those interfaced, the next thing we're going to do is stitch our flap and get that ready to be put on our pocket for whenever we need it. So I'm gonna grab my top flap and my under flap, set everything else aside for the moment. Top flap and under flap are gonna go right sides together. This one's a little wrinkly, so I'm just gonna give it a quick press. Right sides together, and you'll notice your under flap, the one with the double notch, is slightly more narrow than the top flap. The reason for that is because we want this one to be slightly smaller so that it helps pull that seam towards the back of the pocket flap so that it's not able to be seen from the top of the pocket flap. So it just makes it look cleaner and crisper. So we're going to, even though this one is smaller, we're going to force those edges to match on the whole curved side. That's what we're about to pin. We don't need to worry about the top straight side right now. So in order to get those to match, I start at one side, match up my raw edges until I start to get down to that curved area. And then I pause and I go to the other side, and you should have about 1/8 of an inch difference. So make sure to pull that over so that you're getting those edges to match up. Okay, now you should see here, this one is slightly shorter than the other. So now on the bottom of this pocket, I'm going to ease in that 1/8 of an inch difference. So make sure that 1/8 of an inch is kind of spread out evenly throughout that whole bottom of the pocket. Okay, now we're gonna take this over to our sewing machine and we're gonna stitch that at 1/4 inch all along that curved edge. We know we need to do 1/4 inch because we have a 1/4 inch notch here at the top. And we need to be very careful and precise as we do this because this stitch line is going to determine the shape of that pocket flap and the shape of those curves. And this is the very outside of your pocket. It's the first thing that people are going to see when they look at your pocket. So you want to make sure that that looks really nice, professional, and even on both sides. Okay, I've got my machine set to a basic 2.5 stitch. I'm gonna line up the edge of my pocket with that 1/4 inch mark on my foot. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around that curved edge. Again, being very careful to follow the edge precisely. And before you get to this point, it's important to cut precisely because when you come to follow the edge, if you don't have a clean, smooth edge, then you don't have a clean line to follow. So carefully follow that edge to make your curves as smooth as possible. Okay, so there is my finished stitched curve of my pocket. Check at this point that your curves on either corner are even. If they are not, then this is your chance to fix it. So go ahead and you can seam rip and fix those curves at this point before you move on to make sure that they're nice and even. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is clean up our pocket, and then we're going to clip our curves. So this should look familiar. We did this on our patch pocket whenever we were turning under our seam allowances. But now we're going, on this one, we're going to turn this right side out. And when we do so, we need to clip that curve and take out some of that bulk so that our corners will lay smooth. So I'm going to take out triangles of fabric to remove fabric and remove bulk. And when I cut, I need to be using very sharp scissors, and I need to only be using the tip of those scissors, of those fabric shears, so that I get a really precise cut. The issue with using dull scissors or with using the full body of the scissor is that you could easily go too far and cut through your stitches. So you need to be very careful to not cut your stitch line. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now I'm ready to start pressing this. So I'm going to open it up and turn it right side out. And then on those straight areas, I'm going to bust open my seams and press. So down here at the bottom of the pocket and then the two sides, I'll bust open that little seam and press it so I can get those nice clean edges out on my pocket. And I'm just using the tip of my iron where it narrows to get into that area. Now, so you can see on the inside where I've got that pressed. Now I'm going to finish turning this right side out and form those curves. And again, that side with the interfacing, that's your top flap. So that's the one that's gonna sit on top. And I shouldn't be able to see any of the under flap from the top whenever I press it. So make sure to get that seam as far out to the edge as possible. So I roll it between my fingers to get it out, and then press from the front side. And again, because that under flap was a little bit smaller, your seam should be starting to kind of roll towards the back. So when I look at the back, I can see that seam and a little bit of the top flap sticking off. When I look from the front, I shouldn't be able to see the under flap at all. Okay, so there's my flap with nice even curves. Sometimes they get a little bit kind of skewed as you press them. So if it looks like your pocket's kind of leaning to one side, you may have to kind of reshape it. But there's my flap. I'm gonna set that aside for when we need it. The next thing we're gonna work with is our pocket base. And we'll need that pattern piece for the drill holes. And then our welt. So mine was that one that was cut out of white fabric. I'm going to I need my welt to sit right sides together with my pocket base, right over the center of where those drill holes are going to go. I'm gonna give my pocket base a quick press because it's a little wrinkly. And then the way that I usually achieve getting that welt in the center is I look at the back of my pattern piece. I can see my drill holes. Put that face up on top of them, right in the center. And then I can flip it over. Hold it together and flip it. There we go. And so now my welt is right sides together with my fabric in the center of where my drill holes will go. Now I need to get my awl. So you purchased this last semester, and this is what we use to punch through those drill holes and transfer them to our fabric. So punch right through the center. You want to be very accurate and precise with this sample. So you'll hear me say those words very often throughout this demonstration, but precision is extremely important in this sample, because if you get off even a little bit with these, with this rectangle and with the welts as we put them on, it will make a big difference in the final appearance of your pocket. Instead of looking like a rectangle, it will look skewed, or you will have raw edges sticking out somewhere or something like that. So very carefully transfer off those drill holes. And then we're going to use our ruler to connect the dots and create our rectangle where our pocket opening will be. I'm going to use a black pen because I want you to be able to see what's happening on camera, but you want to make sure to use a marking tool that will disappear. So you can use a fine point disappearing ink pen. That's a really good option because it has a nice fine tip on it. Or you can use a chalk that has that rolly tip so that it has a fine line. Again, the point is for it to be a fine line. Okay, so I'm going to line up my ruler with those drill holes that we traced off, and I'm going to connect the corners. And again, precision with marking is going to be extremely important, because these two lines, these two long edges of this rectangle, will determine the entire pocket shape. And those two lines should be 1/2 inch apart, so you can use that guide on your ruler as well to help you make sure that your lines are exactly parallel. Okay, and then we're going to take our ruler again and just connect those lines to make a full rectangle. Okay. Excuse me. Now I need a line right down the center going down the length. So I'm going to use the measurement on my ruler that's 1/4 inch to go right into the center of that rectangle and mark that line. Again, at this point, make sure that your markings are precise. Each of those rectangles should be the exact same width, and they should be 1/4 inch wide. So if one is more narrow than the other, you can adjust your marking at this point. And then the next thing I'm going to do is come 1/2 inch in from the edge. I'm going to create a little mark on both sides. And we're going to create these little triangles. So from that mark, I'm going to go out to the corner of my rectangle. So those triangles will help us later on to finish off those short, excuse me, those short edges of our rectangle. Okay. Now I'm ready to go stitch those two long sides of my rectangle. So I'm not worried about the short sides right now, just these two long sides. So I'm going to pin that, and you can pin parallel or perpendicular to those lines. I'm going to go ahead and do parallel, but whichever makes you more comfortable, you're welcome to pin. Okay, let's go get those lines stitched. Okay, for this next part, I've got my machine set at a 2.5 right now, but these lines, like I said, it's going to be very important that we're precise with where we start and where we end. So if you would like a little bit more control on your stitch, you can push your stitch length down to a 2.0 or even a 1.5. And you'll see I may do that a little bit later in the stitch as well, to make sure that I end directly on the corner. So to start directly on the corner, I'm going to put my needle down first, right in that corner. And that's going to help me make sure that I'm starting at the exact spot that I need to. And then I can start stitching and make sure, again, that you're very precise. When you do your back stitch, if you're worried about going too far back past your corner, then you can do it by hand. That wheel on the right-hand side of your machine, if you turn it away from you, that will be a back stitch. So be very careful with your back stitch. Make sure you don't go too far back. And then we'll continue on very slowly following our line. And then when you get down to the end, again, you want to make sure you end right on that corner. So I'm going to push my stitch length down to a 1.5 so that it takes smaller stitches and I have a little bit more control over where I'm stopping. Okay, so I'm right at the corner. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch and then go right back to my corner. Okay, so you can see that there, where I finished right at my corner and began right at my corner. Same on the other side. I'm going to go back up to a 2.5 for the majority of the line just to make it go a little faster. And then again, I'm going to go back down to a 1.5 to make sure that I'm not going too far past my corner. Okay, so double check those lines before you move on. Okay, like I said, we need to double check these lines before we move on. So typically that's easier to do from the back side. From the front, you've got your markings that are kind of interfering with your view of the lines. So if you go onto the back side, it's a little bit easier to see. Get these threads cleaned up first. Okay, so now at this point, I can check and see if those two lines are parallel, half an inch apart, and then make sure that they're both ending right at the same length on both sides, because that's going to give us those 90-degree angle corners at the end of our pockets, or end of our pocket. So double check that. If you need to fix anything, do it now, because the next step is to cut the fabric, and once we've cut our fabric, we can't go back. So you may need to seam rip and fix before you move on. Okay, the next step is going to be to cut through that center line that we marked. So I usually take a little pinch of my fabric and snip it with my scissors, with my fabric shears. And again, precision is important. So make sure you're using sharp scissors so that you can cut right on that line. And then when you get to the triangle, we're gonna cut out to the corner of our pocket. So I'm cutting out directly to the edge of my stitch. And then I'll do the same going the other direction. Okay, now we're gonna flip this welt piece through that hole. So we've got a hole here in the center. Push all that through and flip it to the back side of your fabric. So now you should have this open rectangle. I'm gonna go to the back side, and when I look underneath that white fabric, I've got my seam. So we're gonna bust open that seam allowance so that we get a clean edge on our welt. Same on the other side. Okay, now we're going to use this excess fabric that we have sitting here to form our welts, to form those long rectangular laps that meet in the middle. So what I'm going to do is this white seam allowance that I've got for my welt fabric, I'm going to use that as my guide for folding my fabric back. So right on that top raw edge of that seam allowance is where I'm going to fold my fabric. And I'm going to press a crease into it. Okay, same on the other side. Let that white seam allowance for your welt stick up and fold it back right where the raw edge is. If we did precise cutting and folding, then our two welts should meet right in the center with no overlap and no gap. They should just touch each other right in the center. Okay, we need to check the size of our welts from the front. So go over to the front. Again, they should be an even width the whole way across. They shouldn't, you can maybe see on mine, it's a little bit more narrow here than it is right here. So I'm gonna go in and adjust that right now before I move on, because this top one is narrow and then it gets a little bit wider here. And then also double check that the top and the bottom ones are the same sizes. So in that area where it was a little too wide, I'm just pulling back my fabric a little bit more and recreasing so that I'm making it more narrow on that front side. Also double check your corners from the front. You don't want it to look like you have a little tuck. So you can probably see right here on mine where it looks like there's a little tuck of fabric, sorry, right there. We don't want that. That means that my fabric is not folded cleanly at that corner. So I'm gonna go in, kind of repress and readjust my fabric to get rid of that little tuck. Okay, so we got rid of that one. Now it looks nice and clean. So check your other corners for the same. Again, your welts should meet right in the center without overlapping and without gapping. Okay, once we are confident that we've got that to the shape and size that we want it, then we are going to finish off those two short sides of our rectangle. So I'm gonna go again back to the front. And now I'm going to fold out of the way just my top fabric. So in this case, it's my blue printed fabric. I'm gonna take that top layer and fold it back. And underneath, you should be able to see your two little triangles. We call those the dovetails. And you should be able to see your welt fabric. So I'm going to, and then you also should be able to see this crease right here. We pressed that into our pocket as we were pressing the shape of the welts. We pressed that little crease in there. That's where we're about to go stitch, is right in that crease line just across this triangle. So make sure your triangles are sticking out. And then I'm gonna pin through them so that my top fabric stays out of the way. I'll do the same on this other side. So just fold back that top layer. And pin your two little triangles. Okay, now we're ready to take this over to our machine and stitch those two short sides. Okay, so place your pocket under your machine and you're gonna line up your needle with that crease that we talked about that goes right here. Now the most important part as you're stitching is gonna make sure that you don't accidentally stitch on this folded portion of your fabric, above or below that triangle. We do not want to stitch on this folded portion. If you do that, then you're gonna be changing the shape of your pocket. So I'm just stitching across the triangle that's sticking out. So I'm gonna go right here at the edge of that triangle, put my needle down first, and then stitch in that little crease. Okay, so there's my first triangle. And then I'm gonna go over to my other one. Same thing, put my needle down right at the edge of that little dovetail or triangle, and you got to make sure you back stitch, so do that very slowly and carefully. Again, you can do that by hand by turning the wheel if you need to. Okay, there is my other one. Okay, back to our ironing board. Okay, so clean up any little thread tails that you may have hanging off. Check on the back, and you should be able to see from the back those two short stitch lines that you did for the ends of your rectangle. I'm gonna unfold my fabric. So right here at this point, you should be able to press those short sides of your rectangle, and your fabric should lay really nice and flat with clean corners. So here you can see my nice clean corner. If your corner is tucking, I'll show you an example of that with a pin. If you accidentally got your stitch on that folded portion of the fabric like we talked about, let's see, there we go. So pretend that was a little stitch that got onto the fold. Then what happens is when you pull this back, you'll see how it's creating kind of a little pleat here at the corner, or a little tuck. So that's why we've got to be careful to avoid that folded portion of the fabric when we're stitching the short end. Okay, and at this point, if something is going wrong with those little short stitches and you're getting tucks in your corner or something, or you have raw edges showing because you didn't get close enough. So if you stitch too far over here to the edge of the triangle, then when you go and you flip it back, you're still gonna have raw edges showing at your corners. So this is the time to go in and fix that short edge before you move on. Okay, the next thing we're gonna do is we're going to close up our welts. So right now, if I pull back this fabric, I can still see into that area, into that welt area. And I don't wanna be able to do that. I don't wanna be able to open them. So what we're gonna do is just like we did on those short sides, we're gonna fold back just that top layer, and I should see my long seam allowance sticking up here. Just the one for the top fabric, not the one for your welt. The one for your welt should be still sticking into your actual welt. So from here, I'm going to lay that nice and flat, and I'm gonna pin, and we're going to stitch right on top of this stitch line where we attached our welt. So we're gonna stitch right on top of that again. Okay, so I'm gonna do this side, and then in a minute, once I stitch that, I can unfold it, and I'll do the same for the bottom side as well. I'll flip up that bottom edge. You'll be able to see the seam allowance on the bottom. I'll pin it and stitch it. So I'm gonna do one at a time. Okay, back over at our machine, I changed the angle of my camera a little bit, so hopefully y'all could see from this right-hand side, that green stitch line. That's what I'm about to use as my guide. So I'm gonna put my needle down right on top of that back stitch that I did last time. And then I'm gonna follow that stitch line and go right on top of it. Now on this one, the most important thing is to not get off of your line towards the side of the garment. So this is my garment and pocket underneath here. Over on this side is all my seam allowances. So if you get a little bit off of your line, it's much better to get off to the left where the seam allowances are rather than to get off to the right. So err on the side of the seam allowances if you have to. But the goal is to go right on top. Okay, so there's my finished stitch line right on top of that first one that I did. Now I'm going to flip that back so that I'm looking at the outside of my pocket, and I'm going to do the same for this bottom edge. So again, take my top fabric on this bottom edge, flip it out of the way so that I'm just looking at that seam allowance area. I'm gonna lay that flat and pin it. And then stitch right on top of that previous stitch line. So needle down on top of my back stitch first, and then follow along. Again, if I get off of my line at all, it's better to do it over towards the side of the seam allowance than it is towards the side of the garment. And again, there's my finished stitch line, and you'll see there's little parts where they start to separate, but my second stitch line was closer to my seam allowance. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board. So before I move on, I'm going to clean up those 2 stitches I just did. So cut off any thread tails you may have. And look at the very back of the pocket. And now you should be able to see the long sides of your rectangle showing through on the back of your welt. Okay, so I'm gonna give that one more good press before we move on. Okay, and now we're ready to put our flap in. So I'm gonna grab that flap that we sewed at the very beginning, and I'm going to insert it in between my two rectangles. And it should just be long enough to reach the edges of your pocket. From the back, I'm going to bring the raw edge up to the raw edge of my welt so that those raw edges match. And make sure that when you insert it, that the side that's facing up is the side with the interfacing. That's the top of your flap. Okay, so just make sure you get it looking nice and even from the front, and then raw edge is even with your welt on the back, right there. And now I'm going to, once again, on this top side, only fold back the top layer of fabric. So I reveal that seam allowance again. So this is the exact same seam allowance that we stitched when we were closing those welts, except now I've got my pocket hidden, or my flap, sorry, hidden underneath. So we're gonna stitch that line a third time, and it's going to catch that pocket flap and secure it in place. And we're only doing this on the top one this time. Last time we did it on the top and on the bottom flap, or bottom welt, sorry, using the wrong terminology. But this time we're only doing it on that top welt because we just need to secure that pocket flap in there. Okay, so just like we did the last time, we're gonna start right at that back stitch at the very beginning. Put our needle down first, and we're just following that line one more time to secure that pocket flap underneath. And again, it's better to go too far to the left towards the seam allowances, sorry, the right towards the seam allowances rather than towards the garment. Okay, and there you go. That's my third line. So you can see mine was about 1/16 of an inch closer to the seam allowance. That's okay. It's still securing my flap in there, and that stitch line is going to be hidden underneath my garment. Okay, now I'm ready to just clean up my thread tails from that last stitch we did. When I open this up and just put my top piece of fabric back down, then I should have my flap secured in place, so I can't pull it out anymore. So we've got that flap secured. Now the last thing we're going to do is prepare our pocket bag. So that lining that's gonna go and create the actual bag of our pocket, we're gonna prepare that and then get it put on here. So I'm gonna grab my lining piece. So this is your pattern piece for the pocketing. I'm gonna give mine a quick press because it's wrinkly from being stored. At this point, you need to make sure to lower the temperature of your iron because you're working with your polyester lining, and you do not want to melt it with a high temperature. So lower it. Your iron should have a setting for polyester. So make sure that you put that there. And then on my pocketing, we have these 2 notches here at the top. That's going to pair with my facing piece. And what we're gonna do is put our facing right side down, match up those notches. So I've got these 1/4 inch notches here. We're gonna match that right sides together, and there will be a gap here at the top of our pocket bag. And what we're gonna do is stitch it, and then we're gonna flip that up to cover up that gap. So grab your facing piece. This is the right side of my fabric for my lining. And again, I have these little 1/4 inch notches on my facing and then notches on my lining to match up. So I'm gonna put that face down, match up those notches with the gap at the top, pin along that top edge of my facing, and we're gonna stitch that at a 1/4 inch and then flip it up to cover up that gap. Okay, let's go stitch this at a 1/4 inch. Okay, putting this under my machine, I'm going to use that top edge of my facing as my guide. Line that up with the 1/4 inch marking on my foot, and then just follow along that edge. So there's my stitch line, and now I'm going to go over and press that and get it ready to put onto my sample. Okay, clean up your little thread tails. And now flip that up right on that seam. So I'm just pressing that up. My seam allowance is going to get sandwiched in between my lining and my facing. And then press it. Okay, now this pocket is ready to start getting attached to our sample. So I'm going to grab my sample again, flip it over to the back side, and the first thing we're going to connect, this is all one big pocket bag. It will get folded in half to create the actual pocket bag. So what I'm going to do is lay it face down on top of my sample, and then the bottom of this welt is going to match up with the bottom of my pocket bag. So scoot that up to where that starts to match up. So bottom of the welt with bottom of the pocket bag. And I'm going to pick those two up so that I pin only through those two layers. I don't want to pin through my garment. So I'm just going to scoot that, flip that out of the way, pin just my pocket bag and my welt. I'm going to flip this the other way so it's a little bit easier to hold. Okay, so like I said, I only have that welt fabric and that lining pinned together. The garment is out of the way. We're gonna go stitch those together at 1/2 inch. And you'll notice that that is a different seam allowance. Everything up to this point has been a 1/4 inch. That's because all of this that we just did all of that seam allowance on the back is going to get hidden inside the pocket. So those are considered enclosed seams. But the edges of our pocket bag will be visible on the inside of our garment. So they need to go up to a 1/2 inch because they'll get more friction, more wear and tear as the body of the wearer rubs up against them. So they need more fabric to make sure that they don't fray down to the point of the stitch line. So let's go stitch this at 1/2 inch. Okay, so line up the end of my pocket bag with that 1/2 inch marking. And then we're gonna stitch that together. Now let's head back over to our ironing board. Okay, here I am. We just did that 1/2 inch stitch. I'm just gonna trim off my little thread tails. And now let's reorient this. So we've got pocket face down, and we just stitched that bottom. Now I'm gonna pull that pocket bag so that it is folded down right on that seam line. And then press it. Okay. And now we're going to, I'm going to try and get all of this on camera as much as possible. I should be looking at the right side of my fabric for my pocket bag, and you should be able to see the printed side of my facing. So now I'm going to fold that entire thing up. So I'm going to grab the top edge of my facing. I'm going to fold it up to where it forms a crease here on the bottom of the pocket bag, and the top edge of my lining and facing match up with the top edge of my welt here. So fold it up, match up the top edge of the welt with the facing and lining. And then we're gonna start pinning that. And again, we wanna pin everything except for our garment layer. So I'm gonna match up those corners and pin that top edge first. It gets pretty thick up here at this point because you've got your welt, multiple layers of your flap, your facing, and your lining all getting caught in there. So it may be pretty thick. Okay, I'm gonna press a crease into this bottom edge. That crease is going to be the bottom of our pocket bag, and we don't need to stitch it because the crease closes up the pocket. So you can see these two sides are open, and the top was open before we pinned it, but this side is already closed, so no need to stitch it. So I'm gonna line up my edges as much as possible. At this point, do not force your edges to match. You want them to be within 1/2 inch of each other so that any difference in the edges shouldn't be more than 1/2 inch because we're gonna stitch at 1/2 inch. But if I force those edges to match at this point, then my pocket is gonna start pulling in weird ways, and it's gonna make the garment pull too. So just lay it nice and flat. If your edges aren't perfectly matching, that's okay, as long as it's not more than a 1/2 inch gap between the two edges. Okay, and then just like I did the top, I'm going to pin those two edges together. It'll be thick up here where the facing is, but after that point where that stitch line is, it'll only be 2 layers of lining getting pinned together. So those are lying nice and flat, pinned together. I'm gonna press that crease at the bottom. And now we're going to stitch these 3 edges of our pocket bag to close it up, but I don't want my garment to get caught in there. So I'm gonna flip it to the right side, to the front, fold those edges of my sample out of the way, just that top layer, and I'm just gonna pin them back so they don't get caught in my stitch. Okay, so now I've got my 3 edges free, ready to stitch. And then as you can see, this lining frays quite a bit. So we're going to need to serge those as well. So we'll stitch them first at a 1/2 inch, and then we'll move over to our serger and we'll serge those same 3 sides. Okay, so I'm just gonna pick a corner to start from. Line it up with that 1/2 inch marking. And then we're just gonna stitch those together all around those 3 sides in one long stitch. And again, it gets pretty thick up here towards the top where you've got all those layers of cotton. Okay, when you get to the corner, just like we learned last semester, make sure your needle is down. You can lift up your foot and rotate that corner. Okay, let's head over to our serger and we'll serge those same 3 sides. Okay, so I'm over at my serger and I'm going to serge those 3 edges. So again, we don't want to cut any fabric off with this, so line it up right with the edge of where your blade's at. The only thing you should be cutting off are like these frayed edges. Times when I'm turning a corner, you'll see me just stitch off the edge like that, and then I'll stitch long enough to where it's able to reach the front of the foot again, because I'll cut those off later. Okay, and then cut off your end, and then we'll head back over to our ironing board. Okay, clean up your sample so you can cut off those little serger tails and any other little threads you may have hanging off. And then I'm gonna unpin these edges that I folded back out of the way. Let those come back out. And now from the front, you should have your pocket with your flap and your welts. From the inside, the first thing you should see is the same printed fabric as the garment. So that's that facing that we put in there. And then further down, you should be able to see your lining for your pocket bag. And then from the back, it should just look like a lining square pocket bag. Okay, so give that one last good press, and then that one will be ready to turn in.